Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We're making our way through July, and I don't know. For me, it's been really hot. Milou, how's the weather been down there?
Hey, it hasn't hit over 100 here, so I can't really complain.
We've definitely had heat indexes well over 100, but I don't know that the air temperature has actually hit over 100, so it's just been this sustained, super muggy. Went from nothing for humidity here in the center to nothing but humidity, like overnight. So, been fun. Been a lot of fun. Cool. Well, let's dive right in. Today we want to talk a little bit about MSSPs, which are, I guess the acronym stands for Managed Security Service Provider. Very similar to an MSP, which many IT people will know what that is, and just Managed Services Provider. The distinction really ends up being, one is kind of you're all-encompassing. They help with bringing up laptops and desktops and managing the network and Active Directory and whatever. I've been in a couple different MSPs, and they do a lot of different things. An MSSP is going to focus a lot more on the security stack. In a lot of ways, it's more or less, you can look at it as kind of outsourcing your SOC, if you will, to be able to have some more expertise in that space. But we'll get into where you choose them and stuff like that. I guess anything, Milou, you want to add to that definition there?
Yeah, I think that definitely highlights it. I think having outsourced the security operations center, I think, is a really big thing for logging and monitoring for a lot of companies. Just a lot of them, they just can't handle the actual triaging of the actual events and alerts that are happening in their systems. So bringing in somebody that is dedicated to doing that full time, has 24/7 resources, is another thing, because usually security teams aren't on call. So these teams are meant to be triaging and looking at the security stack all the time. And so that's a big deal for a lot of companies, because it gives them sufficient coverage to actually see security events when they're offline. And we know a lot of those happen when we're not online. So it's kind of
By design.
Yes.
Yeah, the classic story of, the Wednesday night at 2 a.m. before Thanksgiving, when you've got a 4-day holiday in the U.S., is prime time for having attacks getting launched, because one, most people that are going to deal with it are going to be sleeping if they're not a global organization, and two, they may not notice for 4 days because they're explicitly trying to avoid work for the Thanksgiving holiday. So that 24-hour coverage aspect of things is a huge part of it. Just having somebody watching, because so many incidents these days are so important to react to very quickly. Taking the time to have an alert flag and somebody missing it, and then having to get pushed up the chain, and then all of a sudden your manager's having to hunt people down, and it's hard to deal with cybersecurity these days that slowly. Definitely the aspect of expertise also comes in here. So as we look at, as you're sitting there and maybe you've got a 5-6 person IT team, are any of them security certified? Are any of them security specialists? Are any of them have the bandwidth to sit there and understand, what the latest attack vectors are, and what's going on, who's doing these things, not overwhelmed with other alerts from other systems that aren't security focused. I mean, these are things that I've seen my customers in the past look at and say, we can't do this. This isn't going to be beneficial for us to try to handle on our own. So we need to find somebody that has their CISSP certification, or does those other kind of specialized use cases that security really does require. Now, of course, there's a compliance angle to it, because these days, some of the functionality that an MSSP would give you within the organization are going to be things that, again, are going to be the checkbox items, are going to be the minimum things that you have to do, and should always be more than, in order to meet compliance needs. So I guess, Milou, that's kind of your space.
Yeah, I think for the most part, again, a lot of what the MSSP is doing in this interval is really handling the logging and monitoring and making sure that they're doing proper escalation for incident reporting and making sure that they're getting the right people in the room if there's an incident, if there's an event that needs to be triaged, escalated, and reported accordingly. So they really are your first line of defense in that regard. So they're covering off a lot of the logging and monitoring requirements. So I think a lot of the time you'll see smaller companies, smaller startups, they won't have that yet. And suddenly they'll hit a threshold, right? Where they're not necessarily required by certain standards like a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001. But from a maturity perspective for the security program, once you bring in this outsourced resource, suddenly the maturity of the entire information security program just like matures overnight effectively, because you now have resources that are really starting to just dive into the program and are actually making sure that things are secured and are responded to in an appropriate timeline. And again, are handling some of the things that your internal team just doesn't have the resources for. They don't have the bandwidth. So it's making sure that, whether or not it's required, it's more from like a security maturity perspective of making sure like, hey, not only are we saying that we are secure, we're actually monitoring it and actually have resources in place that are actually making sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing when it happens live, as opposed to, again, like after the fact, 4 days later, which is kind of your worst nightmare.
Yeah, definitely not a ideal scenario at that point. So as a company goes looking for, bringing in that expertise, getting that maturity level instantly overnight, I'm sure there's a number of things that the companies are going to look for in those. I mentioned certifications. Are there any sort of, certifications for an MSSP themselves? I'm not aware of any, but I'm not going to claim to know that space super well.
I'm not sure either. I think, again, some of like having the CISP and some of the other security specific certifications, I would assume are going to be required by some of the analysts that are actually doing the research and doing the work on the ground. I think as you're starting to think about MSSPs, I think obviously making sure that they have trained staff is important. I think also making sure that they can integrate within your existing stack of what tools you have, I think is hugely important, because you want to make sure that they can actually monitor the systems that your team is using on a regular basis.
Yeah, if you're not using Proxmox, or if you're using Proxmox and they don't know how to manage that or ingest those logs or something like that, then you've got a major gap that is either going to be costly and require a little bit more expensive or longer onboarding times for them to figure that out. And then you're kind of out there not necessarily having the best expertise on the back end. Of course, anybody that's on the front end of any technology space is going to be challenged with that no matter where they go. Again, I've seen that with MSPs as well as customers on board. They're like, oh, we've got this other weird thing over here. And the MSP is like, yeah, no, we don't. We could help you maybe. We could adjust those logs and see what happens, but we're not going to be able to be your experts for that. And sometimes that's just a negotiation piece. I mean, you may like 80% of what this one does and 60% of another one. So you go with the 80% of the one with the 80% and you deal with it from there, because I don't know. In my experience, you're never going to find two companies that are going to 100% match each other in these types of scenarios. So yeah, having them have the knowledge of how to deal with what you've got in your environment is going to be critical. I think understanding how they communicate is also super important. As we know, if somebody screws up and they don't communicate with you, is far, far worse than if they screw up and they own up to it right away and they go and they fix it and they have clear communication and open things with you about that. Super important when you're talking about cyber incidents. So you got to feel comfortable that should an incident happen, that they're going to know how to communicate with you, that they're going to have that communication with you, not only on the front end, but throughout the whole process, because you could be talking weeks of dealing with the fallout of this. And if they're not constantly communicating with you about what's going on, what you need to do, what you need to be prepared for, things like, the media coming at you saying, "Hey, what happened there?" If you're not prepared to answer those types of questions at a moment's notice, could be very detrimental to the company as a whole.
Yeah, and then I think some of the other things is obviously like references, customer reviews, checking in with other teams that work with these, asking for references from the actual MSSP, but also speaking to your community, seeing, what tools are they using, who are they trusting within their systems? Because obviously these are individuals that are getting heightened access to potentially production environments. So you definitely want to make sure that you're being mindful too of like, what's the reputation of the company and how are they, also meeting their security requirements on their end.
Yeah, I mean, that's somewhat classic due diligence, but you're going to be handing some pretty high level keys to this company, because they're going to have some pretty deep access to your environment, depending on how much you want them to execute for you, which in some cases you definitely do. I mean, you could just bring them in for just monitoring, in which case they're at least getting all of your log files. So you got to trust them to have some intimate knowledge about what's going on in your environment. But odds are you're going to give them some execution abilities to be able to do some stuff, to be able to, I don't know, power on, power off virtual machines, and to potentially change the identity structure so that if they do find, bad identities, that they can deal with that. So yeah, you gotta have a high level of trust there. And of course that requires understanding who they are and where they come from and what other people think about them. Of course, contracting is always going to be a big thing there, especially when we talk about having that level of access. You want to make sure that if you're hiring an MSSP and they have that level of access, you need to make sure that it's very, very clear cut on who's responsible for the changes. If it goes all the way to arbitration and legal type stuff, what that's going to look like. Should you have the ability to sue them should something happen? Again, very much your space, Milou, so I'll let you talk to that a little bit more.
Yeah, some of the key things are definitely making sure that they have service level agreements so you understand like how quickly they are going to respond to certain events, certain escalation points, and what those response times look like. Because obviously it's not helpful if they're going to take over 48 hours to let you know if something's going on. So making sure you have service level agreements. And then similarly, I would say like incident notification and escalation requirements. They in contract know exactly who they're supposed to reach out to, when, how quickly. For the most part, I think confidentiality is going to be covered within the standard agreement, and making sure that, they're also required to comply with certain security requirements. Your team can audit them in the same way that your customers can, making sure they maintain a SOC 2, for example. Then pretty clear use of who their subcontractors are, what are their tools that they're using, and then making sure, of course, as you had mentioned, that liability is an indemnification and the insurance requirements are pretty clearly defined in the contract. And then also, like the right to audit, the information security documentation that's required. And then also, what happens in the case that your team has outgrown them or is ready to bring somebody else in or is going to outsource it or potentially bring somebody on in-house to manage it full time. So kind of understanding, I think those are kind of the key requirements. I would say, again, I think service level agreements and the response times is really important to understand how quickly the team is actually going to respond to the potential alerts in the system.
Yeah, for sure. And those are all not just expectation setting, but expectation, like putting it into stone, making it a binding type of an agreement. With companies that may have to deal with a HIPAA or PCI DSS, those types of very industry specific, I'll say, type of compliance needs. How does that usually play into these types of contracts?
Again, for the most part, I don't necessarily think an MSSP would have access to potentially like the health data within the system. They might have access to the logs of the people that are actually accessing them, but I wouldn't necessarily imagine that they would have actual access to that super sensitive information that's within the system. That being said, you might also require that they have additional requirements to maintain like a HIPAA certification, as well as like their team does HIPAA training and stuff like that to making sure that if they do encounter some type of health data that they're trained on the fact that they need to keep that confidential and that there are additional heightened requirements of how to handle that information. So I think that would potentially come down to expanded security documentation if you're, working with a covered entity per se, that you would want to make sure too that that subcontractor is also complying with HIPAA in the same way that you're required to.
Cool. So as part of all that too, like I said, setting expectations is super important with them. That's kind of the legal aspect of it. As you're looking at what those expectations are, you talked very heavily about service level agreements and response times and the timing of things. A big part of that is understanding what information they need to access and how they need to be given that data, because since they're technically outside of your environment, how are all those log files going to get to that MSSP's systems? Are they running a SIM or a source system within their customer's environment, or are those logs all shipping to a central environment? Like understanding how all those pieces connect and work out. You need to be prepared for those conversations, because those are the conversations. And the MSSP is going to walk you through those things. They'll be very clear about what they need and how they need it to make sure that it's our job to walk customers through these things and get them set up. They need to understand those boundaries, so that if I'm bringing an MSSP into a hospital, I need to know where those systems are with HIPAA data so that I can draw some hard lines around that, so that I don't accidentally leak that. Like, that's on me to make sure that if I don't have that, if I don't include them in my HIPAA agreements as a subcontractor, then I'm going to be responsible for leaking data in that regard. So understanding what is in and out of bounds is going to be super critical. And then just the general, when an incident occurs, how do I want that to occur? So that the MSSP can follow my guidelines, can do things the way I want to do them, to call the right people. Again, a good MSSP is going to have a lot of good experience on that, and they're going to generally be working with a lot of customers that maybe don't know how to answer those questions. So they should be good at helping to walk you through those things. To me, that's a sign of a good MSSP. Is they're going to be like, okay, now we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about who needs to be involved and when they need to be involved and what the steps are. Here's our standard procedures. We've got some recommendations. We've got some empty spaces. We've got some requirements. Let's workshop this whole thing. I don't know if it would go to the level of being a full-on tabletop exercise, but ideally you'd love an MSSP that would do a tabletop with you on occasion. And then be able to identify what kind of reporting you need at the end or throughout the process. How often we're going to review things, doing things like tabletops, like that should all be working. Yeah. So, you talked about from a contract perspective, there's a lot of setting SLAs and defining, kind of what's in, what's out. There's a bit of a additional undercurrent to that. A big part of that is just identifying where the MSSP is going to play in your environment. So whether that be what they're going to monitor, like I said, what they're going to manage, how much execution in the environment they can do, being able to put up those guardrails and making sure that, hey, this has got HIPAA information in it, so we're not going to have you have any rights into this system other than the logs themselves, maybe. And then, we'll be on the hook for having to deal with any execution within that environment. Like, those are all things that need to be decided during the contract negotiation. And definitely something you want to pay attention to during the picking which vendor can sometimes come before you even start that negotiation piece of things. Knowing what you are going to be held legally accountable for versus what the MSSP is going to be legally held accountable for is going to be super important there too. Again, that's part of that legal negotiation aspect of things. And then, of course, understanding what reports, how they're going to communicate, who's going to make the decisions, what decisions you want made. Honestly, it's taking your incident response plan, opening it up and going through it with them and saying, here's what we want you to take care of. Here's what we'll take care of. Here's when you need to notify us on things. Like, hopefully you have that incident response plan. If not, an MSSP is a great way to start to build that, probably. These are all things that, as you're investigating which MSSPs and going through that dating aspect of things, trying to understand is, will you do tabletop exercises with us? Will you do monthly check-ins? Will you do annual reviews? Will we do annual tests? Like, all of these things are things that you should potentially be working out with them during the investigation process, but definitely during the negotiation side of things. And understanding, like, when things change, if the company grows, if we get a new kind of data, what happens if we add a new server into the system? What happens if you all at the MSSP decide to change your software, and how much of that burden has to land on us in order to account for those changes? Like, these are all things with any partnership, especially one that's going to go as deep and wide as the MSSP agreement's going to be, should be worked out. So Milou, anything to add to that as somebody that has actually negotiated these types of things?
No, I think for the most part you covered it. I think it's also I think the onboarding of the MSSP, once the team has agreed the contract's good, I think the onboarding is probably the most important part of making sure that you're super clear on, like, who's responsible for what on each side, what are the expectations, how are you going to be doing the reporting, and then running through a couple example scenarios. Ideally, you're not waiting until the first event arises. You know what I mean? You're getting them access to the logs, and then you're running through some examples to making sure that everybody's super clear on, like, what is going to happen when they do report on something. I think the onboarding portion is really important. And then I agree with you of making sure that as the relationship evolves and grows and these teams get more used to one another, that they're making sure that they're staying up to date on, any changes in the system, when new logs happen, when new things are changing. Also, if an analyst changes or what that looks like, to making sure that everybody's staying abreast of kind of changes within the environment. But yeah, I think you covered a lot of it for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. um, there's so many things too. Like, that's the tops of the waves, in my opinion. But equally important to understanding what they are going to do is understanding what you shouldn't expect them to do, right? You can't expect them to be your entire security program. You can't expect them to be your entire compliance program, to eliminate all the risks, to meld into everything you do. Like, there's going to have to be compromises that you as a company are going to have to make on maybe the systems you use, or the how, if I was an MSSP and I was onboarding a client that was doing some really risky behaviors around identity creation or management of their systems, I don't know that I would agree to bring them on as a client if they were going to introduce risks to me or my other clients, right? So, there's a bunch of those things. It's a relationship, and that means there's give and take on both sides. There is, responsibilities on both sides. It's a mixed responsibility model, I guess, to put it in terms that people that have dealt with the cloud have dealt with. You need to make sure at what level the handoff is going to be, because there's always going to be some responsibility. You can't. This is not a set it and forget it scenario, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, like common pitfalls, again, I think you had already kind of highlighted them as making sure you're not like over relying on this stock, making sure that your security team internally is still responsible for the core program and is relying them as an additional resource and not the only thing that's happening within the security program. And then just making sure, again, that, you know, the team continues to work together as the program grows and matures and evolves. These things are not static. This is a relationship that should continue to evolve as the company matures. So yeah, I think that covers a lot of kind of the things that I am aware of as I'm kind of occasionally helping companies decide which MSSP to bring on to go over their program.
Yeah. So that kind of takes us into during the relationship aspect of things. And just like any other partnership, it's something you should constantly be not necessarily questioning, but reevaluating. These are business relationships, so either party could change. We've both worked at companies that got acquired in the midst of things, both where we would be the the consumer, the client, but also had experiences being the vendor that got acquired. And obviously that changes the nature of the relationship, no matter which side is getting acquired. Sometimes businesses go out of business. Sometimes just the nature of the environment changes. Like you may decide that this one particular system is the only way to move forward and be successful as a business, and your MSSP is like, yeah, sorry, no, we can't do that. Or the MSSP has some sort of situation that you're no longer comfortable with them, or the trust is broken, that kind of thing. So it's important to continuously kind of evaluating that. Beyond the things that we look at in the investigation side of things, like, are there any specific scenarios that you've seen or heard of that people should be looking out for with their existing MSSPs?
Not necessarily. I think for the most part, the service provider relationship, like it falls to the same common pitfalls that like any other service provider would necessarily come in through. I don't think they're necessarily like MSSP specific.
Yeah. And, MSSP is just a specialized version of an MSP. So if you've dealt with those, you could apply a lot of the same logic here. So yeah, and then, the ultimate thing could be, at some point, and we've seen this in the, again, I'll draw a parallel to the kind of the cloud move, where the concept of repatriation has been popular, maybe not necessarily in action, but in conversation, where we've moved stuff to the cloud, we've moved stuff to an MSSP, but now we're at a certain level where it makes sense for us to onboard that, to bring that in-house and be able to do that work ourselves. And maybe it's cheaper, maybe it's safer for us. There's risk is always part of the equation. It shouldn't just be purely about the money side of things, where, we don't have to worry about them accidentally getting access to HIPAA data, or, we don't have to worry about the communication barrier that may exist during a heated moment between two different organizations. Being able to make sure that how you're going to offboard from an MSSP and build it yourself, is going to be an important thing to kind of continuously think about. Like, it's not just, is this MSSP the right one for us, but also is having an MSSP the right thing for us? Or do we have some people in-house already that could potentially build that SOC at this point? Do we have the ability to hire these types of specialists to bring them in-house? So constant reevaluation, just as you always should do with any vendor relationship on that side of things. Anything else you want to add, Milou, before we kind of close this out? We've kind of touched on the full life cycle at this point, and a lot of the stuff at the front end, of course, is going to apply in the back end, just as a slightly different perspective of things. But there's obviously a lot to it.
Make budget for MSSPs.
Yeah.
Well, not inexpensive resource, but they are incredibly valuable if you can add them to your team.
Yeah. Making sure that you can pay for a good one. This is not necessarily a place where picking the cheapest option is always going to be the best. You definitely want to pay for the quality that you can get there. So cool. Well, I guess with that, we'll leave you to go search for your MSSPs if that's something that you're doing. Hopefully this advice will be a little bit helpful for you, especially for those of you in smaller businesses that may be looking to outsource that for whatever reason. But we appreciate you joining us, listening into that, and we appreciate you tuning in as often as you do. Hopefully this is not your first time, and definitely hope it's not your last time. Happy to get any advice or feedback that you have. info@socializingsecurity.com is the email address to do that, or just hit us up on LinkedIn would be the two best ways to get us. So appreciate you all. We look forward to the next episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.